Imagine two neighbors arguing over a property line.
Right.
I mean, it happens every single day. One thinks the fence should be, maybe 2 feet to the left, and the other strongly disagrees.
Right. And usually you'd just call a surveyor or maybe get some lawyers involved to sort it out.
Exactly. You sort it out through the system. But now, imagine that exact same scenario, except one neighbor is literally shouting through a megaphone, and the other is standing there holding a stash of completely unregulated, illegal firearms.
Yeah, that completely changes the dynamic. You aren't really dealing with a standard boundary dispute anymore at that point.
No, you're looking at a full-blown internal security crisis. And if you're trying to understand the mechanics of governance in a complex region, treating that arms scenario like a simple disagreement over a garden fence is, it's basically a fundamental analytical failure.
It absolutely is.
Okay.
And that failure to distinguish between, administrative friction and structural security threats, that's exactly where most policy analysis just falls completely apart. Because when the asymmetry of force enters the equation, like with those firearms, the entire rulebook for conflict resolution basically has to be rewritten on the fly.
Which perfectly brings us to today's source material for this deep dive. We are looking at a towering stack of reporting, editorials, and analysis from the August 14th, 2026 edition of the Assam Tribune.
It's a heavy stack today for sure.
It really is. And for you listening, whether you're deep in the trenches preparing for the APSC CCE, or you're just someone who demands a rigorous, uncompromising look at how policy actually functions on the ground, well, our mission today is to decode the mechanisms behind these headlines.
Yeah, we really need to bypass the noise and understand the how and the why of today's most critical governance, economic, and geopolitical issues.
Exactly.
Because the material today really demands that kind of systemic approach. We're looking at a spectrum that forces us to connect what might seem like isolated incidents.
Like what specifically?
Well, we have to map out the physical volatility of interstate borders in the Northeast, trace that same demand for boundaries into constitutional amendment debates, scale up to the macroeconomic paradox of India's trade deficit, and finally—
It's a huge pivot, yeah.
Right, finally look at how cascading infrastructure failures in our immediate international neighborhood actually threaten our own domestic stability.
Okay, let's just jump straight into that megaphone and firearms scenario, because honestly, it isn't hypothetical. It's happening right now on the Assam-Arunachal Pradesh border.
Yes, unfortunately, it's very real.
The reports in the Tribune detail these fresh clashes at the Likabali entry point in Salapathar up in the Damaji district. And the situation has escalated so much that the Taka Mizing Porn Kabang, the TMPK, along with a few other local groups, has launched an indefinite economic blockade.
Which is a huge escalation.
Massive. And this is a direct retaliation for a filing incident back on August 10th at Mingmang Badati that actually left 11 Assamese people injured.
And we really need to pause on that point. Because economic blockades initiated by civilian organizations, that is a massive red flag for state failure.
How so?
Well, it indicates that the local population has just completely lost faith in the state's monopoly on violence, right? And its ability to secure its own borders.
Because they feel totally unprotected.
Exactly. When citizens take economic strangulation into their own hands like this, they're essentially trying to create a rudimentary grassroots deterrence mechanism because the official deterrence has just collapsed.
And the official political response, reading through this, feels almost entirely disconnected from that reality on the ground. Like the Assam government is demanding custody of 4 accused individuals from Arunachal Pradesh, maintaining that the firing happened entirely within undisputed Assam territory.
Right.
But meanwhile, you have members of parliament from both states, including Parliamentary Affairs Minister Kiran Rijiju, putting out these statements urging people to resolve land disputes through peaceful dialogue.
Yeah, those parliamentary appeals for peace, they are standard diplomatic protocol. But they're entirely insufficient for the operational reality of the crisis you just described.
Wait, I'm actually a bit confused on the operational reality here, because law and order is strictly a state subject under the 7th schedule of the Constitution, right? Assam Police handles Assam, Arunachal Police handles Arunachal.
That is the constitutional baseline, yes.
So why are the official sources in this reporting aggressively demanding that the Union Ministry of Home Affairs, the MHA, step in? Doesn't inviting the MHA to adjudicate a state border dispute violate the spirit of federalism?
Well, it would if this were merely a civil dispute over land records. But that takes us right back to your opening analogy about the firearms.
Oh, the asymmetry of force.
Exactly. The sources are explicitly highlighting the unchecked availability of illegal firearms in neighboring states, specifically Arunachal Pradesh and Nagaland. The Assamese villagers on the border are, by and large, totally unarmed.
So it's an entirely uneven playing field.
Completely. When armed actors cross a state boundary to enact violence, it ceases to be a state-level public order issue. It suddenly elevates to a threat to internal security, which is absolutely the purview of the union government.
Because Assam can't just send its police over the border.
Right. Assam cannot unilaterally send its police force across the border to conduct disarmament operations in Arunachal Pradesh. The constitutional architecture specifically prevents it. Therefore, the MHA is literally the only entity with the overarching jurisdictional authority to neutralize that arms asymmetry.
Wow. Okay, so for anyone analyzing this from a governance perspective, the key takeaway isn't that states can't talk to each other. It's that dialogue inherently requires parity. You can't have a state-level dialogue when the negotiating leverage is being dictated by cross-border, non-state armed actors.
Exactly. The MHA has to level the playing field first before any real talks can happen.
But the reporting also digs into the economic driver behind this violence. And this is fascinating. It isn't just people fighting over abstract lines on a map. It's a highly organized land grab driven by cash crops.
Yeah, the agricultural angle here is huge.
The sources say actors from the hill states are pushing down into the plains, encroaching on reserve forests. And they're using heavy machinery, literally power saws, to clear land for palm oil cultivation.
The ecological and economic mechanics playing out here are just devastating. If you look at it historically, the demarcation of states in the Northeast often separated the hills from the plains.
Right.
However, the plains possess the highly fertile, accessible geography that you actually need for aggressive, large-scale cash crop cultivation. And palm oil is incredibly lucrative.
But it's also known for being an ecological wrecking ball, right?
Absolutely. It requires vast, unbroken tracts of completely cleared land.
And clearing reserve forests with power saws means they're completely bypassing environmental clearances, forest conservation acts, and indigenous land rights all at once.
Yes. They are taking complex, biodiverse forest ecosystems and replacing them with a monoculture that heavily depletes both groundwater and soil nutrients.
It's just extraction.
Exactly. This downward geographic pressure, moving from the hills to the plains, is essentially economic opportunism that is weaponizing the porous nature of the border. They're exploiting the jurisdictional friction between the states to extract maximum economic value through illegal palm oil plantations.
Leaving Assam to basically deal with the ecological degradation and the territorial loss.
Precisely.
That reframes the entire conflict. It's really not a border dispute at all. It's an armed, cross-jurisdictional resource extraction operation. And that realization kind of forces us to look at how we design governance to prevent these kinds of systemic vulnerabilities in the first place.
Which naturally brings us to the internal boundaries within Assam. Specifically, the quest for administrative autonomy.
Right. Let's talk about the BTR. We have a report about a delegation from the United People's Party Liberal, the UPPL, holding high-level meetings with the Union Home Secretary regarding the Bodoland Territorial Region, the BTR Accord.
This is a really critical pivot for our deep dive today, moving from physical borders to constitutional architecture. The BTR Accord represents this monumental effort to engineer lasting peace by basically redefining how power is distributed.
And the UPPL delegation is heavily pushing two specific constitutional levers here. First, they want the passage of the 125th Constitutional Amendment Bill. Now, for the listeners, we know the Sixth Schedule is the framework for tribal administration in the Northeast, creating autonomous district councils.
Right. That's the baseline.
And we know the 125th Amendment is designed to strengthen that. But practically speaking, how does passing an amendment in New Delhi actually alter the daily governance mechanics for the Bodoland Territorial Council down in Kokrashar? What teeth does this actually give them?
That's a great question. The Sixth Schedule, as it was originally drafted, created a framework for autonomy, sure, but over the decades, the operational reality has often been heavily constrained by the state government.
They still hold the reins, basically.
Exactly. The 125th Amendment is designed to fundamentally upgrade that relationship. It proposes shifting a massive amount of legislative and executive power directly to the councils themselves.
Well, what kind of power?
We are talking about the authority to manage vital everyday sectors like municipal administration, village planning, public health, and primary education. And doing all of that without needing constant ratification from the state capital in Dispur.
Oh, wow.
It essentially aims to transform these councils from subordinate administrative bodies into highly empowered local governments.
But, I mean, sweeping legislative powers don't really mean anything if you can't pay for the public health and primary education you're suddenly in charge of, right?
You hit the nail on the head. That's the exact issue.
Which brings us to the second lever they're pulling, Article 280. They want the BTR's financial mechanisms explicitly linked to the Finance Commission. Now, for an APSC aspirant, they already know Article 280 governs the distribution of tax revenues between the union and the states. But how does tying an autonomous council directly to that union tax devolution fundamentally change their power dynamic with the state government?
It completely severs their dependency on discretionary funding.
Discretionary being the key word there.
Exactly. Currently, autonomous district councils often rely really heavily on grants and aid from the state government's consolidated fund. That creates a massive inherent political vulnerability.
Because if the parties don't get along...
Right. If the political party running the council is at odds with the political party running the state government, those funds can easily be delayed, reduced, or just tangled up in endless bureaucratic red tape.
It becomes a political leash.
Exactly the opposite of autonomy. By invoking Article 280, the UPPL is demanding that the Finance Commission constitutionally mandate a direct, guaranteed stream of funding directly for the BTR.
So it's not even about the amount.
No, it's not about asking for more money. It is about fundamentally restructuring the pipeline so the money arrives as a constitutional right, not as a political favor. It ensures that the council actually has the financial fuel required to execute the legislative powers promised by the 125th Amendment.
Okay, so the analytical synthesis here for you listening is that true autonomy is basically a two-engine vehicle. You need the 125th Amendment to act as the legislative engine, and Article 280 to act as the financial engine. If either one of those is missing, the vehicle of local governance just stalls out.
And then you risk sliding back into the exact kind of political frustration that breeds instability in the first place.
Yeah. We just saw how failing to respect physical and constitutional boundaries leads to conflict. But what happens when we try to engineer our way out of geographical realities entirely? That takes us into the physical environment and infrastructure sections of the paper, where the consequences of bad design are literally washing away the ground beneath our feet.
Moving from the friction of political mapping to the sheer force of physical geography.
Yeah. Let's look at the editorial tackling the Upper Assam floods. The piece makes a point that, honestly, should be obvious, but is constantly ignored in policy circles. Treating these floods as merely a meteorological event, just a lot of extreme rainfall, is a catastrophic analytical failure.
It totally misses the bigger picture.
The editorial outlines this deadly synergy. Extreme rainfall, yes, absolutely, but compounding with high sediment loads, failing embankments, and heavy human intervention.
The Brahmaputra River system is it's one of the most complex fluvial environments on the planet. To actually understand the failure of the embankments, you have to understand the sediment mechanics first.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the Himalayas are young fold mountains, meaning they are geologically very active and highly susceptible to erosion. When the monsoon hits, the rivers don't just carry water, they carry an astronomical volume of sediment down into the Assam plains.
And our primary infrastructural response for decades has been to just build embankments, these walls of earth on either side of the river just to keep the water in a neat little channel. But using embankments to contain a river with that much sediment is, well, it's like sweeping dust under a rug, but the rug is in a room with a shrinking ceiling.
That is a fantastic analogy.
Eventually, the floor is higher than the walls, and the water just spills over.
That is precisely the mechanism of aggradation. By artificially constricting the river channel with these embankments, you completely prevent the river from naturally depositing its sediment across the wider floodplain.
So where does the dirt go?
It drops out of suspension and settles right on the riverbed. So year after year, the riverbed rises. In some stretches, the bed of the Brahmaputra and its tributaries is actually higher than the surrounding human settlements.
Wait, higher? So the river is effectively flowing on a raised aqueduct made of its own silt?
Literally, yes. And the moment there is extreme rainfall or a massive surge from upstream dams, that water has immense kinetic energy. The embankments, which are often, poorly maintained or weakened by human encroachment, they simply cannot withstand the hydrostatic pressure.
They just pop.
They breach. And the resulting flood isn't just a slow inundation. It's a high-velocity, catastrophic release of water.
And that infrastructure failure immediately triggers a huge social crisis, which the sources highlight in a deeply disturbing way today. In the letters to the editor section, we see reports of volunteers facing severe harassment while attempting to distribute flood relief.
It's tragic to read.
It is. We also see groups, like the Assam Tribune group itself, actually stepping into the void to distribute relief materials at Dirikul MV School in Sivasagar. But why the hostility toward people bringing aid? I mean, what does that harassment actually tell us about the sociology of a recurring disaster?
It reveals a really profound collapse in social trust. When communities face annual devastating losses, and they recognize that the systemic infrastructure designed to protect them, the embankments, is actively contributing to their ruin, a really deep cynicism takes root.
So they're angry at the system, not the volunteers.
Exactly. The harassment of relief workers is rarely about the volunteers themselves. It is a misdirected projection of rage against a systemic failure. The victims feel totally abandoned by the state apparatus during the mitigation phase, right? So when external actors suddenly appear during the desperate relief phase, the frustration just boils over.
It demonstrates that you really cannot divorce physical infrastructure from the social contract. When the infrastructure breaches, the social fabric tears right alongside it.
Perfectly said.
And that concept, that infrastructure is fundamentally linked to social stability and geographical reality, brings us to a massive challenge facing the Northeast Frontier Railway, the NFR. The reporting notes that railway tracks on Line 1 and Line 2 are actively settling, meaning they are sinking near the New Harangja station in the Lumding-Badarpur Hill section.
Right. And we aren't talking about a minor maintenance issue here. We are talking about the Earth literally swallowing a massive piece of connectivity infrastructure.
Yeah. So the Lumding-Badarpur section, is this just a textbook case of engineering ambition clashing with fragile geology?
Absolutely. The hills of Dima Hasao and the Bareil Range are composed of highly unstable sedimentary rock formations. They are heavily folded and faulted due to intense tectonic activity over millennia.
Add to that the intense monsoon precipitation.
Right, which lubricates the slip planes within the rock itself. So you have an environment where landslides and massive subsidence are not anomalies. They are the baseline geological reality.
But, I mean, doesn't this suggest a massive failure in the initial surveying and design phase? If we know the geology is basically a giant tectonic sponge, why push a heavy railway alignment through it without accounting for the sheer stress of the terrain?
It often comes down to the friction between political timelines and geological timeframes.
What do you mean?
There is immense political and economic pressure to deliver connectivity rapidly, right? To physically bind the region together for strategic reasons. Sometimes that pressure completely overrides the immense cost and the time required to engineer solutions that truly respect the geological fragility.
Like tunnels instead of tracks on the surface.
Exactly, like extensive tunneling instead of surface alignments or massive expensive slope stabilization projects. When you try to force rigid infrastructure onto highly dynamic geology, the geology always wins. Always.
So the track settling at New Harangajau is literally just the Earth asserting its physical dominance over a blueprint.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay, so we see the catastrophic results of failing to design for the macro environment, the rivers and the mountains. But the sources also pivot to an equally critical failure in designing for the micro environment, the human scale.
This is a really important shift in the paper.
There is this fascinating profile on an initiative by a young architect named Rajveer, who is working alongside Shishu Sarathi in Guwahati, and he is advocating heavily for inclusive architecture. He is arguing that accessibility for persons with disabilities cannot just be an afterthought.
This is a really profound extension of the infrastructure debate we were just having.
Oh, so?
Because if building a railway on unstable ground is a structural failure, building public spaces that exclude a whole segment of your population is a moral and constitutional failure.
That's powerful. The traditional approach to accessibility really seems to be entirely reactive. Like, a building goes up and then someone realizes they need a wheelchair ramp, so they just bolt some ugly, steep concrete incline onto a side entrance around the back.
Right. It's treated as a compliance checklist item rather than a core design philosophy.
But Rajveer's initiative is arguing for universal design right from the blueprint stage. Why is that initial integration so difficult for modern urban planners to grasp?
Well, when you bolt a ramp onto a side door, you are sending a very clear spatial message to a person with a disability. You're saying, this space was not actually built for you, but we will make a begrudging accommodation.
Yeah.
Inclusive architecture, on the other hand, recognizes that human bodies exist on a massive spectrum of ability. Designing public infrastructure, whether it's a park, a government office, or a transit hub, with built-in ramps, tactile paving, and sensory-friendly acoustics from day one, it normalizes that spectrum.
It democratizes the physical space itself.
Yes.
If you design a city that only caters to the able-bodied, you are effectively placing an embargo on the participation of disabled citizens in the economy, in governance, and in cultural life.
Precisely the connection we need to make today. True development isn't just about the sheer volume of concrete poured. It's about who is actually permitted to navigate that concrete.
And that transition from engineering physical space to engineering cultural space is the perfect bridge to our next major theme. Because we have established that you can't engineer peace or development if you ignore the deep-rooted physical and human realities of a region.
Right.
Well, the exact same principle applies to identity. You can't govern effectively if you ignore the cultural bedrock. So let's look at language. The Assam government's Home and Political Department has officially notified the use of the Dimasa language for official administrative purposes in Dima Hasao alongside English.
This notification is, frankly, a masterclass in how linguistic policy functions as a tool for political empowerment.
See, for an outside observer, it might just look like changing the font on a government form, right? But what is the actual structural mechanism of linguistic democratization? How does this actually change the power dynamic between the everyday citizen and the state in Dima Hasao?
Well, think about it. The state machinery is inherently intimidating to most people. It is composed of complex laws, dense bureaucratic procedures, and immense authority. When the interface of that machinery, the forms, the public notices, the legal proceedings, operates in a language that is not native to the local population, you create an invisible but incredibly impenetrable barrier to justice and services.
The citizen is inherently disadvantaged from step one.
Exactly. They have to rely on intermediaries just to translate their grievances or understand their basic rights.
So they become subjects rather than active participants.
That is exactly it. By notifying Dimasa for official use, the government is completely dismantling that barrier. It allows the community to engage with the apparatus of the state on their own cultural terms. It validates their identity not just as some cultural artifact in a museum, but as a legitimate medium of civic power.
When you can demand your rights in your mother tongue, the state suddenly becomes much more accountable.
It forces accountability, yes.
And this demand to exist on one's own cultural terms has a fierce historical precedent in the region. The sources today feature a really compelling historical retrospective on the Zeliangrong resistance movement during the freedom struggle.
This is a fascinating piece of history.
It really is. Now, anyone studying modern Indian history knows Rani Gaidinliu. She is a towering figure. But this piece brings her predecessor, Jadoning, into focus and specifically anchors their entire movement to the Bhuban Hills.
Right.
Now, I want to push back on how we usually read this kind of history. We often treat these locations merely as strategic military hideouts, places to run from the British. Why is understanding the specific geography of the Bhuban Hills so vital to understanding the Zeliangrong resistance itself?
Because applying a purely military lens to indigenous resistance completely misses the metaphysical clash that was actually occurring.
The metaphysical clash.
Yes. For Jadoning and the Zeliangrong people, the Bhuban Hills were not just a tactical fortress. They were sacred geography.
The actual source of spiritual authority.
Exactly. In many indigenous cosmologies, the land is not just a commodity. It is a living entity intricately tied to the community's identity and their spiritual survival. Jadoning's movement, the Haraka movement, was simultaneously a religious revival and a political rebellion.
So they couldn't be separated?
No. When the British colonial forces attempted to suppress them, they weren't just trying to put down a tax revolt, they were actively attempting to sever the community from their spiritual epicenter.
So the resistance was fundamentally about the right to exist culturally and spiritually in their ancestral domain. The British basically saw a territory to be administered, but the Zeliangrong saw a sacred landscape to be defended.
That is the crucial distinction you have to make. When Jadanang was executed by the British and Rani Gaidinliu took up the mantle, the persistence of that movement wasn't driven merely by political ideology, but by an unbreakable bond to that specific cultural geography.
Which makes the history incredibly potent. But how does a society ensure that this kind of rich, complex history doesn't just atrophy into a museum exhibit? How does it remain a living, breathing component of modern identity?
Well, it requires institutional recognition, certainly. But more importantly, it requires active, unscripted engagement by the youth.
Which the sources highlight exactly with this Swadesh Swabhiman initiative. It's described as a platform specifically designed for the younger generation to rigorously discuss Assam's history, language, economy, and its contemporary challenges.
That's vital.
It is. It's treating cultural identity not as a fixed text to be memorized, but as a living discourse. And alongside that, we see the highest levels of institutional recognition, with veteran Assamese actress Chaitanya Das receiving the prestigious Sanjeet Natak Academy Fellowship, an award from President Drupadi Murmu.
Those two elements, the grassroots intellectual engagement of the youth and the apex national recognition of artistic mastery, those are the twin engines of cultural resilience.
Right.
Because an identity that cannot be debated, adapted, and celebrated in the modern context will inevitably stagnate. For anyone aiming to enter the civil services or public policy, understanding this vibrant, living cultural matrix is vastly more important than merely memorizing administrative codes. You cannot govern a society if you are deaf to its cultural frequencies.
Absolutely. But cultural sovereignty and administrative autonomy are incredibly fragile if they aren't backed by a robust economic foundation.
Oh, without a doubt.
You can have the most empowered autonomous council and the richest cultural heritage, but if the local economy is completely hollowed out, the system will eventually collapse. Which brings us to the economic engine of our deep dive. The sources provide a fascinating contrast between hyper-local agricultural logistics and the staggering complexities of global macroeconomics.
Let's start with the local piece first.
Yeah, let's start in the tea gardens of Assam. There is a strong proposal moving forward for a new tea auction platform within the state, and the statistic driving this is mind-blowing. Nearly 55% of Assam's massive tea output is produced within a highly concentrated 120-kilometer radius.
That includes adjoining districts and even spilling into parts of Arunachal Pradesh.
Right. That level of geographical concentration for a primary agricultural commodity is exceptional, and it entirely justifies the demand for localized market mechanisms.
It does. Because the producers are arguing that shipping bulk tea vast distances just to auction it introduces massive inefficiencies.
Like what?
Delays, immense transport costs, and heavy warehousing fees.
Right. From a purely mechanistic supply chain perspective, why does moving the auction platform closer to the production hub dramatically alter the profitability of these tea estates?
Because in agricultural commodities, friction is the enemy of margin. Every single time a bulk product is moved, loaded, unloaded, or stored before a sale is finalized, value is destroyed.
You're just paying for it to sit there.
Exactly. Capital is tied up in inventory that is sitting in transit rather than generating cash flow. By establishing a modern, highly efficient auction platform within that 120-kilometer radius, you collapse the time between production and price realization. You cut out the logistical middlemen.
So it's especially huge for the smaller players.
Yes. For the producers, especially smaller estates or bought leaf factories, improving liquidity and reducing transaction costs isn't just about slightly higher profits. It's about basic survival in a highly volatile global market.
It is about keeping the economic value generated by Assam's resources actually circulating within Assam's economy for as long as possible.
Exactly.
But if we zoom out from that localized 120-kilometer radius to the entire Indian macroeconomic picture, the concept of keeping value inside the country becomes a massive structural problem. The July trade data is basically a masterclass in economic paradox.
It really is a fascinating contradiction.
On one hand, India's merchandise exports surged by 19.63%, hitting $44.24 billion. I mean, that is robust, undeniably positive growth. We are selling a huge volume of goods to the world.
Specifically, we saw massive jumps in bilateral trade. Exports to China rocketed up nearly 65% to $2.2 billion. And exports to the U.S. grew by almost 13% to over $9 billion.
So by all conventional metrics, the export engine is roaring. But simultaneously, the overall trade deficit widened to a 6-month high of $31.98 billion. We are selling more than ever, yet we are bleeding money globally. Why? Because our imports rose by 17.52%, hitting a staggering $76.22 billion. And the prime culprit driving that massive import bill is crude oil, which jumped over 17% to $18.31 billion for just that month.
This is the Achilles heel of the entire Indian growth story.
It reminds me of running a wildly successful bakery. Imagine your cake sales are through the roof. There is a line out the door, and you are shipping pastries to all the neighboring towns. Your top-line revenue looks incredible, right?
Sounds great on paper.
But your profit margin is actually evaporating, and you're taking on debt because the cost of the imported butter and specialty flour you absolutely need to bake those cakes has skyrocketed. You are working longer hours, running the ovens hotter, selling more products, just to hand all that cash over to your suppliers.
That is a very apt comparison.
How does a sovereign economy break out of an import-dependent export cycle like that?
That bakery analogy perfectly isolates the structural flaw. As long as India's economic expansion and the energy required to power that expansion is tethered to massive imports of crude oil and foreign electronic components, the trade deficit will remain a permanent, glaring vulnerability.
Right.
Any geopolitical shock that spikes the price of oil instantly wipes out the gains made by our export sectors. This vulnerability is the exact target of the NTEI Ayog strategy detailed in today's reports.
Let's talk about that. The NEI Ayog report identifies 4 high-potential sectors designed to transform India into a global manufacturing hub: chemicals, textiles, telecom and network equipment, and solar photovoltaic manufacturing.
These aren't random choices.
No. Now, I want to drill down into that last one, solar PV manufacturing. It isn't just about being green or combating climate change. From a hard-nosed macroeconomic perspective, how does manufacturing solar panels domestically actually plug that $18 billion crude oil leak?
It is the ultimate strategy of import substitution at the macroeconomic level. Currently, to fuel economic growth, India imports massive amounts of crude oil. If we transition to renewable energy to reduce that crude oil dependency, but we simply import all the solar panels from China.
We haven't actually solved the trade deficit.
Exactly. We have just swapped one massive import bill for another.
We stopped importing the butter, but now we are just importing pre-baked cakes.
Precisely. NTI-Ayog's strategy recognizes that true energy security and trade balance require capturing the entire value chain. By developing domestic solar photovoltaic manufacturing, going all the way upstream to polysilicon, wafers, cells, and modules, India aims to produce the infrastructure that produces the energy.
Okay, that makes sense.
When you do that, you aren't just creating a new export commodity. You are actively shrinking the domestic demand for imported fossil fuels. You are systematically replacing foreign energy imports with domestic capital expenditure.
And the exact same logic applies to the telecom and network equipment sector. We import a staggering volume of electronic components. By incentivizing domestic manufacturing in telecom, you substitute those foreign imports with local production, retaining that capital within the domestic economy.
Right. It is a highly aggressive, two-pronged attack. Scale up high-value manufacturing exports while simultaneously aggressively plugging the massive import leaks in energy and electronics.
But executing that strategy requires immense capital, uninterrupted supply chains, and a stable geopolitical environment, which is why domestic economic policy can never, ever be divorced from international relations.
Yeah, everything is connected.
Always. That brings us to our final lens for today, the neighborhood watch. Our domestic economic security is intrinsically linked to the stability of the nation surrounding us. When the neighborhood is on fire, the smoke inevitably blows across our borders, disrupting trade, triggering migration, and forcing massive security realignments.
And right now, the situation in Bangladesh is highly volatile.
It is. The reports detail a crippling energy crisis gripping the country. And just to be absolutely clear on our sourcing here, for you listening, we are analyzing the claims put forward by the Awami League, criticizing the interim government led by Muhammad Yunus.
Right. We aren't adjudicating the politics here.
Not at all. We are simply examining the socioeconomic reality described in these reports to understand the systemic fragility on our borders.
Exactly. And the reports claim daily power outages lasting anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. In a modern economy, a 12-hour power deficit is not an inconvenience. It is a systemic shutdown.
The cascading effects are catastrophic. We see reports of education just grinding to a halt because digital tools and connectivity are useless without electricity. Students are literally trying to study by the light of their mobile phones.
And then there's the garment industry.
Right, which is the absolute backbone of Bangladesh's export economy. It's facing massive multi-hour stoppages. But the detail that truly underscores how fragile complex supply chains are is the impact on agriculture, specifically the semi-intensive shrimp farms in Khulna.
This is a textbook example of how infrastructure failure immediately destroys high-value agricultural assets. Semi-intensive aquaculture requires a highly controlled environment. The shrimp populations are very dense, meaning the natural oxygen in the water is depleted extremely rapidly.
So they rely entirely on electric water aerators to maintain the biological oxygen demand.
Yes.
When a 12-hour power cut hits, it's not like a factory where you just pause the assembly line and start it back up tomorrow, right? The aerators stop, the oxygen crashes, and the entire biological asset, the crop, literally dies in the water.
It's devastating. A political or macroeconomic failure to secure energy instantly wipes out the livelihood of a farmer in Khulna, and it destroys a massive export revenue stream for the country.
And from New Delhi's perspective, this level of economic degradation next door is a severe national security concern. A destabilized Bangladesh facing collapsing industries and mass unemployment creates a volatile environment that can easily spill over into cross-border migration pressures, smuggling, and major regional diplomatic instability.
We are seeing the chaos created by a sudden vacuum of governance and infrastructure.
But the sources also look further east today, detailing a completely different type of geopolitical instability, one driven by calculated, overwhelming authoritarian control. The reporting covers the ongoing tragedy of the abduction of the 11th Panchen Lama by China.
Right, and while this isn't a new event, the analysis highlights how this specific action is emblematic of China's broader strategy in Tibet.
Which is what, exactly?
It is the systemic subjugation of cultural and spiritual authority to absolute political power.
Wow.
The succession of the Panchen Lama is one of the most critical mechanisms of spiritual continuity in Tibetan Buddhism. By abducting the recognized Panchen Lama decades ago and installing a state-sanctioned proxy, the Chinese Communist Party wasn't just committing a human rights violation. They were attempting to literally hijack the theological infrastructure of an entire civilization.
They are trying to engineer loyalty by controlling the spiritual succession. It is the ultimate manifestation of the state attempting to override cultural geography, much like we discussed earlier with the Zeliangrong, but on a massive totalitarian scale.
If we place these two international crises side by side, we see the dual threats facing Indian diplomacy.
Let's lay those out.
On one border in Bangladesh, you have the acute instability born from a sudden vacuum of infrastructure and political consensus, leading to immediate economic collapse. On another border, with China and Tibet, you have the chronic instability generated by a state asserting absolute, suffocating control over a suppressed population.
Both environments breed deep, unpredictable volatility. And for anyone looking at Indian public policy or defense strategy, the lesson is incredibly clear. You cannot secure your own domestic economy or your own borders without maintaining a hyper-vigilant, deeply analytical read on the shifting tectonic plates of your neighbors.
Which really brings us full circle. Whether you are analyzing a local border skirmish driven by palm oil or a geopolitical standoff driven by spiritual succession, the underlying mechanisms of power, geography, and resource distribution, they remain exactly the same.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We unpacked why the Ministry of Home Affairs must intervene in the Assam-Arunachal border clash to neutralize the asymmetry of illegal firearms.
We did.
We dissected how the 125th Amendment and Article 280 fundamentally rewire the power dynamics of the Bodoland Territorial Council. We looked at the catastrophic engineering failure of building embankments that trap sediment and railway lines that ignore Himalayan geology.
We explored the macroeconomic paradox of India's surging exports being swallowed by a massive crude oil import bill, and how Niti Aayog's push for domestic solar manufacturing aims to finally break that cycle.
And finally, we mapped the geopolitical tremors caused by infrastructure collapse in Bangladesh and authoritarian overreach in Tibet.
It's been a rigorous cross-section of the forces shaping the modern state.
It really has. But before we wrap this deep dive, I want to leave you listening with a completely different kind of mechanism. A historical anecdote buried in today's paper that offers a strange, brilliant metaphor for everything we've discussed.
Oh, I know one.
The year is 1770. The English scientist Edward Nairn is at his desk. Back then, if you made a mistake with a pencil, you used a rolled-up piece of moist bread to rub the graphite off the page.
A rather inefficient and perishable tool, to say the least.
Exactly. So Nairn reaches for his piece of bread, but by sheer accident, he picks up a small cube of natural rubber that he had acquired from South America. He rubs it on the paper, and it works perfectly. He accidentally invents the modern eraser.
A revolutionary mistake.
But think about the philosophical implication of the eraser. Whether you are an aspirant writing an essay for the APSC exam, an engineer designing a railway through the Boreal Range, or a policymaker trying to draft a complex constitutional amendment for an autonomous region, progress is not defined by an absence of errors. You are going to draw the wrong line. You are going to build an embankment that fails. The secret to long-term stability is recognizing when you have made a mistake and having the right institutional tools to rub it out and correct your course.
That is a phenomenal lens for evaluating public policy. Are our institutions rigid, or do they possess the capacity to erase and adapt?
So as you reflect on the dense web of governance, economics, and geopolitics we decoded today, ask yourself, where in our current systems is the governance eraser missing? Where are we still stubbornly rubbing bread on a piece of paper when the reality of the situation demands a completely new tool? And if you were at the drafting table, how would you implement that course correction? Keep rigorously analyzing the news, keep challenging the obvious answers, and most importantly, keep diving deep. We will see you next time.